I just want to take one last look at this idea of faith like a mustard seed and this interaction that Jesus has with his disciples when they're wrestling about a failure that they've experienced, and the challenges that he gives them and the challenge that he gives the people around them as they're kind of walking through that difficulty. So in Matthew chapter 17, if you're familiar with the chapter, it's the Mount of Transfiguration, right? It's where Jesus has gone up with Peter, James, and John. So only those three disciples go with him. And he says that he goes up on a mountain and he's transfigured before them, and he becomes as bright as the sun. It's as if it's a glimpse of kind of the heavenly Jesus, his true form, who he really is, outside of taking on, as Hebrews says, the likeness of sinful flesh. And so he is, illumined before them. They observe this. Peter has some great ideas. He says, because Moses and Elijah also appear with Jesus, and Jesus begins to talk to them about the plan, I suppose, of salvation and whatnot. And so Peter says, hey, here's what we'll do. We'll build you each a tabernacle, right? Because the tabernacle is supposed to be in the Old Testament where God dwells. Right? So Peter says, hey, we're going to build you each a tent, and I guess just live on this mountain in this tent, or I'm not really entirely sure what his purpose is. And at that point, there's a voice from heaven that is accredited to the Heavenly Father that says, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. So essentially, Peter pipes down, and then kind of the moment passes, and they come back down the mountain, and they've seen this incredible thing. So in Matthew 17, as they come back down the mountain after that experience, they're asking him some questions and so forth as he comes back down. But that's where we're going to pick up kind of right as they hit the bottom there in chapter 17, verse 14, where he says, when they came to the crowd, so they've come off the mountain, and now the other 9 disciples are there with a crowd. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire, into the water, and I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Then, when they came together in Galilee, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. And it goes on from there. And so this is just imagine, if you will, just kind of like to lay out the scene, not to create dramatic effect, but maybe for some context to understand where the disciples are coming from. Because this would be a pretty substantial failure, I think. You know, and we're going to actually read the account that's also in Luke chapter 9, because there's actually different details in Mark, Luke, and Matthew. They all have different details about the event. For time's sake, I'll quote some out of Mark, but we'll also read Luke 9 in a moment. But in this event, what happens is they come down the mountain. So 3, Peter, James, and John, go with Jesus. The other 9 are down at the bottom of the mountain. As we'll see in Luke, they're actually in an argument with the crowd. But just think about this for a second. So Jesus comes down. This man comes running from the crowd, falls at his feet, and says, will you heal my son? Now, we know from Mark, when he asks, will you heal my son, he says to him, if you can. He says, if you're able, if you can do something, will you please heal my son? And Jesus replies, kind of that famous reply that probably many of us are familiar with. He says, if I can, don't you know that all things are possible to him that believes? So that's kind of that famous word. And then the man's response is, I believe, help my unbelief, right? And then Jesus answers his prayer. So that's kind of out of Mark. So in this case, what we're setting up here is the disciples, these 9 disciples, just think for a moment, and I don't want to insert too much into the passage, but what must that have been like? What must it have been like to attempt to cast out a demon and fail at it in front of a giant crowd? My guess is that would be embarrassing. That would be scary. They're now arguing with the crowd. What were they arguing about? We don't know. Perhaps the crowd is demanding an answer of why they failed. Perhaps they're trying to say, hey, it's because of your unbelief, whatever it might be. But they're now having an argument with the crowd when Jesus comes down from the mountain and appears there. So in this case, it's not covered yet, but Jesus' reply then is to this man, he says, I brought him to your disciples, verse 16, but they could not heal him. In verse 17, he says this, you unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you and bring the boy here to me? And then Jesus heals him. Then in verse 19, it says, because we're going to go back and cover these things, it says, then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? So he replies, because you had little faith. Now remember last week we turned to Hebrews 11 and we looked at, for 2 weeks now actually, we've looked at this definition that's so important about what faith is. That faith is, from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, faith is a confidence inside of us, in our hearts and our minds, a confidence for what we hope for, what we expect. In other words, faith by virtue is simply, I believe that God will do what he says. That when he says I can expect things, I believe him to do that. And that's why faith can, sometimes, even by Jesus, it gets almost talked about in kind of quantitative terms, in the sense of like, how much, right? Because in this case, he talks about faith of a mustard seed. So if we remember last week, we talked about that faith of a mustard seed. He talks about the kingdom of heaven as a mustard seed. And he says it's the smallest of all seeds in the garden, but then when it grows up bigger than anything else in the garden, right? So a mustard seed, a Middle Eastern mustard seed, is tiny. It's like the speck of a pencil. It goes into the ground, and in one season, it would grow to be about 12 to 15 feet high. So it grows to be this huge mustard bush kind of a thing. But it starts off as the smallest of seeds. And Jesus' comparison there is that's what God's kingdom is like. That it oftentimes it starts very small. It starts off in a seed, and then it grows into something that's incredible and impressive and provides a lot in a garden. Okay. So now he says that if you had faith like a mustard seed, speck faith, tiny faith, right? The smallest thing, the smallest seed, speck faith, then you could have done this. You could do, and he makes the metaphor that we're all familiar with now. We've read it. You could move a mountain, right? How many songs are about moving mountains? Now, obviously, this is a metaphor because we never see Jesus move a mountain. We never see the disciples, move a mountain. Paul doesn't write like, "Hey, make sure you're moving mountains." This is a metaphor to point out the impossible, right? That if you have speck faith, tiny faith, we want big faith. He says if you have tiny faith, then you can do the impossible that God would have for you. So all of a sudden, the quantitative amount and this type of thing, I'm not going to say it's not important because Jesus does note great faith, which we talked about last week. But the point is that there's a simple point or place where we can trust God, and that will develop something and something incredible would happen.